recognize the ranking member for opening statement. I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement. I yield back.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Distinguished gentlelady from California, Mary Bono. Gentlelady is recognized.
Chair now recognizes the lady from California is recognized.
I'm pleased to introduce Congresswoman Mary Bono, former U.S. Representative for California's Inland Empire and Desert Region from 1998 to 2013.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Welcome to Sagely Speaking. I'm your host, Mary Bono, and I'm so happy you're here. On this podcast, I hope to bring you insightful conversations with a variety of guests from all walks of life, people with stories, wisdom, and perspectives that inspire and inform. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, and if you feel inspired, leave a 5-star rating. It helps us reach more listeners like you. Now let's dive into today's conversation. I am so honored to be joined by today's guest, or this episode's guest, Admiral James Stavridis. I am floored. I've been intimidated and overwhelmed. My weekend was stressful. I'm trying to prep for this phone call or this episode. Oh, see, I'm already nervous. And you know what's funny? I over-prepare sometimes. And then I went, forget it. Just talk. He's a pro. He'll talk me through everything that I'm going to ask him, whatever it might be. So Admiral James Stavridis, he graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1976. And while he was in the Navy, he served as the commander of United States Southern Command, and that was from 2006 to 2009, and commander of the United States European Command and NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe from 2009 to 2013. And he is the first naval officer to have ever held these positions. He has published 14 books is the count I have. My guess is it's more since then. But he's written books on leadership, the oceans, maritime affairs, Latin America, as well as hundreds of articles in leading journals. His books have sold over 500,000 copies worldwide, and I have a feeling that number's old as well. But I reached out to him, and we connected on this book that Admiral Stavridis wrote called Restless Wave. And I explained to him I'm the daughter of a World War II veteran. He was a waist gunner in a B-17 crew in the mighty 8th Air Force, 95th Bomb Group. Extreme pride that I had in my father. So I have a particular interest in World War II history. And what I love about your book is something that I really like, and that's not just sort of military history, but the human side, the human toll. So Restless Wave, Admiral, welcome to Sagely Speaking, and let's start talking about Restless Wave.
Gosh, so kind, and thanks for having me on. And as I said a moment ago, thank you for your service in the Congress. It is a challenge to go into government, whether you're doing it in the military, as a diplomat, in the CIA, in the Congress. It is an act of service, and I thank you. And I think both of us would encourage anybody listening to the podcast to find time to carve out serving your community, your nation, your state, your city. So an honor to be with someone who has pulled more than her share of the load in Washington. Hey, the book is a joy to me because, as you said, Mary, it's historical fiction, but I hope it captures love and war. It kind of has a steamy love triangle embedded in the middle of it. All these are the realities of going to war. And it's set in the early 1940s, kind of starts off in Key West. You see Ernest Hemingway at the prime of his life, shifts to the Naval Academy where your husband and I both went to college, if you can call going to the Naval Academy college. And it then tracks a protagonist and his roommate out to Pearl Harbor in the days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. So it's kind of they know war is coming. It's kind of motorcycles and learning to surf and eating shaved ice on the North Coast. It's all great. And then boom, Pearl Harbor happens and suddenly they're plunged into the hell of war. In the midst of all that, and I'll kind of wrap it here because everything I've told you is kind of the first part of the book, but in the middle of the war kind of accelerating, both of these two young Navy officers become deeply, deeply entangled with the same woman. And how that resolves and the realities of that, I think, are sketched out in very real ways. So The Restless Wave, it's really a book about both love and war, set a long time ago, but I think the lessons in it are timeless.
what I love so much about it, and again, I'm in the middle of it, and I won't tell you what point I'm in, but is you really develop the character, especially the lead character, so beautifully. And you definitely begin a bond, and you're interested in his story, and you're compelled, you're drawn into the book. And I felt that through. I told my husband last night, I felt like I was, walking up the brow with him onto the ship, and I could feel every step. And I think that's such excellent character development. And then what I love, and I want to know your thinking on incorporating real people into the story. Ernest Hemingway, you've got the famous surfer Duke.
Kamehameha, yeah.
Yes. So how do you work these characters, these real life characters into your story, and why do you choose the people you choose?
What a wonderful question. And I think you've really put your finger on the challenge of historical fiction. It's that we know how the story comes out, right? We know the United States is going to win the war. We know Ernest Hemingway is going to be an enormous, big-time selling author. We know so much of the storyline. And therefore, I think the temptation as a writer of historical fiction is to have your character meet all the cool people, and suddenly the character is meeting not only Ernest Hemingway, but also William Faulkner, and somehow Steinbeck ends up in the novel. And you're walking your way through American literature, and that's before he goes to Washington and meets FDR, and that's bad historical fiction. So I think the trick, and what I've tried to do in the book, is to kind of sprinkle some of those real characters, the ones that I find particularly compelling, along the road, if you will. And you correctly point out Ernest Hemingway, who I think everybody knows. I'll give you one other example of it. Very different character, somebody named, a man named Doris, nicknamed Dory Miller, African-American, big guy, championship boxer of the Pacific Fleet, came out of Texas, hard scrabble early years, joins the Navy, and becomes a hero on December 7th, 1941. He leaves his normal mess station, which is down in the cooking area for the officers. He charges up to the bridge, then he ends up on an anti-aircraft gun and shoots down a couple of Japanese Zeros. He gets the Navy Cross. It's a big deal. Tragically, 2 years later, he dies. You kind of follow that storyline. You get to know him. He was in real life an extremely likable, affable, kind, thoughtful person, kind of a giant of a man who would protect his shipmates. And, I'll conclude, tragically, he dies in the war. But the good news, Mary, and you'll appreciate this from your days in Washington, the Navy just decided to name our next nuclear-powered aircraft carrier after Dory Miller. These are the carriers named after George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Harry S. Truman. The next one is going to be named the Doris Miller after an African-American Navy petty officer. That's a pretty good ending to the story.
Absolutely. Forgive me, I did not know he was a real character. But I will tell you, when you introduce him, you do a fabulous job of pointing out that he's a gentle giant.
Yeah.
A loving, kind, gentle giant. You also pointed out that, he was not allowed to serve in a combat role because days were different then. And yet, when duty called, up he went right to the guns and, picked up arms and fought and received a medal for it.
Yeah.
So
it's just a wonderful story. And by the way, a movie that I actually recommend, and I know you know a lot about the entertainment world as well as government and a lot of other things, but a movie I strongly recommend is Pearl Harbor, the most recent version. Ben Affleck plays the lead. I think it's his best role ever. Maybe not the highest bar to get over, but it's a great role for Ben Affleck. He's a fictional character, but Dory Miller is brought to life in that film, and it's played by Cuba Gooding Jr., who's a wonderful African-American actor, and he just captures that role and puts it to life on the screen with all its heroism. A lot of heroes on that day on Pearl Harbor, and I try to honor them and bring their stories to light. And again, back where we started, that's kind of the role of a writer of historical fiction. You want that character development of your fictional characters, but you really want to get the history right.
Well, I learned something, and I remember seeing that movie. I remember being blown away by the CG and how far. I think it was the first really effective CG use in a military movie that I remember. And so I will rewatch it again and connect the dots on this character played by Cuba Gooding Jr. But
for extreme extra credit, and I know your admiral would agree with this, the next big event in World War II is the Battle of Midway. And that is an even more recent and exceptionally well done film. Same points, the CG, all of that, but it has the kind of unlikely casting, but I think it works beautifully. The Admiral Nimitz, who's the centerpiece of the war, this sort of tall, stately, right out of central casting admiral, is played by Woody Harrelson, who just steals the movie. I mean, it's so good. And so if you put those two together, it's Pearl Harbor, one of the most tragic days of loss for the American military. And then we often say the miracle at Midway. 6 months later, the U.S. forces, the Navy, come back and effectively destroy Japan's ability to really launch further attacks at the United States. So those two films side by side really are a nice combo to reading The Restless Wave.
Thank you. And I remember that. The Woody Harrelson, I thought, what a stretch. And you think of him, some surfer doing drugs on the beach with all these beautiful women surrounding him, that kind of a thing. And he was amazing in that film. Yes. And my producer and my intern are both filmmakers. And I'm sure we'll talk about this afterwards on what did you think about casting Woody Harrelson as Admiral Nimitz? I mean, for God's sakes, you were thinking, this should be like a Clark Gable kind of figure.
Exactly.
Jimmy Stewart kind of character.
It's so well done. And, we can't leave the topic, by the way, without just pointing out Woody Harrelson's work in The Hunger Games, which is, I think, an extraordinary sequence in that set of films as well. Not naval, but really about heroism and mentoring and a lot of the other topics we talk about. He's a very complete actor.
He is very versatile, and it was pleasant to see this. But I wanted to, how many fiction books have you written, and how many more leadership books, and what's next with your writing career?
Yeah, so I've written 14 books, as you correctly pointed out in that very nice introduction. Thank you. 3 of them are works of fiction. The first 2 novels are called 2034, like the year 2034, and then the sequel 2054, which advances that storyline to the year 2054. The next book out is the final book in that trilogy. That's called 2084, and it deals with the long-term effects of globalization and environmental degradation. So those 3 novels are kind of a package that look ahead into the 21st century. At the same time, I've always felt you learn so much by looking back at history. And so the book we're talking about today, The Restless Wave, is the first of 5 books that are going to follow this character through World War II, into the Korean War, into the Cold War, Cuban Missile Crisis, and toward the end of his career, he'll be involved in Vietnam and the Riverine Wars there. So it's really a very broad-based look at great power war in the beginning, kind of regional conflict in the Korean War in the middle, the great standoff of the Cold War and where we almost broke the world, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then finally the small wars of the 20th century, that being Vietnam as a centerpiece. So I like to look forward in some of my fiction and back in some of my fiction, and I continue to do that. And right now I'm in the looking back mode. So
first of all, I highly recommend Restless Wave. I can't say enough about it. It's great reading. You pick it up and you can't put it down. But what is your day job? Is it writing or?
No, not at all. I am a partner, and my title is Vice Chairman Global Affairs for a large international financial firm called the Carlyle Group, or just Carlyle. We have about $500 billion assets under management. We're a global firm. So my job there, Mary, is geopolitical advice. How do the events in China and Ukraine and the Middle East, how is that going to affect our investment thesis as we manage all these investments for clients? And then that's my main job, my day job. My offices are in New York and Washington. I do have kind of a fun side hustle, which is not writing. I'm chairman of the board of the Rockefeller Foundation, which is a very large corporate foundation, like Gates Foundation, Bezos Foundation, MacArthur Foundation. Ours is the first of those, the first charitable trust established in the United States well over 100 years ago. So my job there is make decisions about where to distribute charitable activities. I'll give you an example. We're working on electrification of sub-Saharan Africa, bringing power into these small villages. We're doing lots of projects on hunger and food here in the United States. We have a big presence in India. So those are kind of my real day jobs, if you will. International finance, and then chairman of the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. The first one pays the bills. The second one is all about giving back.
And your entry into the pearly gates, right? Giving back. But, I didn't thank you for your service up front. You thanked me for mine, and I was actually so humbled, thinking I'm going to listen to that part of this podcast over and over and over. But thank you for your service and your leadership. But if I could take you back a little bit to your years at NATO, what was the biggest challenge that you had to confront at that time?
Yeah, unfortunately, a very easy answer. I was the commander of NATO from 2009 to 2013, and I would say 75% of my effort was focused on Afghanistan. I had 150,000 troops under my command, about 100,000 Americans, 50,000 principally Europeans, and we were engaged in fighting the Taliban, trying to get Afghanistan into a stable position and build up an Afghan army and an Afghan police force. When I left in 2013, about a decade ago, a little over a decade now, I think things were actually in pretty stable flight. We were reducing our footprint. Over the years I was there, we brought down the number of American and European troops by 80%. Things were looking fairly good for the Afghan army and the Afghan police forces to really take over those missions. Over the next 10 years, as we all know, conditions deteriorated. Ultimately, the Trump administration made a decision to really essentially pull out all but a tiny number. And then, of course, the Biden administration came in, pulled out the last few Americans, and then the entire edifice collapsed. So, unfortunately, Mary, my 75% of my time was focused on Afghanistan, and then the remaining 25% was in the Balkans. We had major peacekeeping operations. We had a 6-month conflict in Libya, you might recall, which ended in the overthrow of Gaddafi, and we ended up also combating quite successfully piracy off the east coast of Africa. So it was a busy 4 years, but principally I was focused on Afghanistan, and it breaks my heart to watch how that has ultimately turned out a decade later.
I like to look back, not to assess blame sometimes on a person, and I'm not trying to do that at all, but I do like to look back and wonder where we had policy failures. And I am somebody who's been very involved and interested in drug abuse prevention, especially with the opioid and fentanyl crisis, and I'd love to get to that a little bit later. But when you look back in Afghanistan, and I was in Congress at the time, so we debated, how do we treat the poppy eradication? And are the farmers going to turn against us, or what do we do? How do we manage that? Do you have second thoughts on our decisions on how to handle the poppy eradication programs?
Yes, I do. And I think you're right. The two principal dark sides in the Afghan body politic were the drug trade, and then its evil twin, which is corruption and bribery, and these are two dark forces that became deeply intertwined in Afghanistan. I think our policy failures as a general proposition are threefold. Number one, we underestimated the Taliban. That has nothing to do specifically with drugs. And the Taliban, by the way, have at times encouraged the drug trade and at other times have cracked down on it quite viciously. But we underestimated the Taliban. I think number two, we overestimated the efficiency, the strength of these Afghan security forces that we painstakingly built up over 15 years. And in the end, they collapsed. We, particularly the military, have to own that. We failed to inculcate a real ethos inside those forces. And then number three, your point, I think we failed to address the drugs and the corruption piece sufficiently. So how could we have done those things better? Since you ask about drugs, I think that extreme eradication policies, which leave farmers bereft with nothing that they can effectively do in their fields as a standalone policy, and when you couple with it extremely aggressive policies going after drug labs and treating them as combatants, ultimately it's going to turn the population against you. A far better approach would have been really aggressively pursuing crop substitution, finding trade and infrastructure building programs so farmers could get legitimate crops out to markets, and using the anti-corruption piece of it to go after the drug kingpins who are fueling all of this. So our failure in, I think, all three of those areas, kind of underestimating Taliban, bad intelligence, overestimating the security forces and our sense that, hey, we gave them good uniforms, we gave them good rifles, we given them all this great training, they're going to stand and fight. They didn't. And then number three, our failures on corruption and narcotics, I think were, as I look back, we could have put more into that. For people, we were talking about movies earlier. The movie Charlie Wilson's War is a fascinating film that unpackages some of the failures. At the end of the film, Charlie Wilson, who's was a Naval Academy graduate, by the way, Charlie Wilson is back on Congress, back on the Hill. You know this, Mary, desperately seeking money for developments, for schools, for clinics, for alternative crop programs. Can't get a nickel. Why? Because the carnival has moved on. There's a lot to unpackage there, as you say, to understand the causes of that failure.
Well, Admiral, I think for me, I remember distinctly being told that there would be a cultural shift amongst the people, certainly the women, that they would be happy to be liberated. Yeah. And we believed in that. I, as a female member of Congress, really believed this was going to be critically important, that they would rip off their burqas and join us. And that was a huge miscalculation, a misperception on my part. Yes. Had I known, what I know now, I think I would stand up and really question something like this very hard. And so I think I was perplexed that we missed the whole cultural shift and the whole cultural dynamic and the importance of... Yeah,
and I'll tell you from a military side of things, it wasn't for lack of trying. We actually stood up what we called the Afghan Corps. These were officers, both male and female, who we taught them Pashto and Dari and sent them to schools and really tried to embed them in the culture. But it just didn't work. And frankly, I think the twin set of events is actually back in Vietnam, something I'm old enough to remember, where we, again, underestimated the Viet Cong. We underestimated the North. We underestimated their grip on the population. And your point is spot on. We see everything through our Western eyes, and we often miss the realities on the ground in two places very distinctly different, Southeast Asia and the mountains of Afghanistan. But, to suddenly parachute in with a set of Western values and say, hey, here's how it's going to be, it collapsed.
We'll continue with our interview in a moment, but first I'd like to thank my sponsors. Lucy Pet Foods is the leader in gut health. Their formulas for life feature prebiotic, balanced fiber that nourishes your dog and cat's total health. Every purchase helps support the Lucy Pet Foundation, a 501c3 charity helping animals. Save 15% off your first order and use the promo code SAGELYSPEAKING, all one word, and you will get free shipping at lucypetfoods.com. If you're committed to tackling the opioid and addiction crises, then you need to be at the 2025 RX Summit. Use code SAGELY, that's SAGELY, for an extra $100 off. Join top experts and professionals as we share strategies for prevention, deflection, treatment, and recovery. Don't miss this chance to be part of the change. Head over to rx-summit.com to register now. That's rx-summit.com for an additional $100 off.
As the mom of two amazing kids, I know how important it is to keep our children safe. And that's why I talk to them about the dangers of drugs. It is not always an easy conversation, but it's essential. By talking openly, we can help our kids understand the risks, which will help them make smart choices. Create a safe place for our kids to ask questions and share their feelings. Together, we can empower them to just say no. Start the conversation today. Your kids' future depends on it. The greatest gift is a conversation.
And now, back to our interview.
When I think about the opioid trade, and again, what frustrated me with policy is there are quotas that are set by the DEA on how much raw product we can bring in, and that's to make legitimate opioids for pain control. So we never paid attention to the quotas, and the quotas were actually, we'll just import however much they can produce. Yeah. That was the quota, was whatever they can make. So again, these policy failures on top of each other. And again, Admiral, you talk about, that we parachute in with Western ideas. At some point in time, just human nature takes over. I call us the human animal so often that we forget that sometimes we cannot be trained highly enough because there are things that we just are. But you wrote another book called Convergence, I believe, that talks a lot about this era and your observations. Can you tell us a little bit about Convergence?
Sure. Convergence, the idea of it is that there are kind of like two streams of danger here. And one is the narcotics and corruption that we're talking about. That's stream one. And stream two is terrorism. Those who have a political desire to destroy and undermine and commit atrocities. And those two streams are dangerously close to converging. In other words, at some point, these drug cartels, let's shift the frame to Latin America and the Caribbean, these drug cartels from my days at U.S. Southern Command, I assure you, they want to move product. They're going to make it happen. They're smart at business. They're smart at logistics. They're clever, they're innovative. At some point, what I worry about is the corruption piece, which could lead a terrorist organization effectively to be hired to move for example, a weapon of mass destruction into the United States. That's the convergence. That's what you want to avoid, is the narcotics and corruption that converges somehow with terrorist activities. And so far, that hasn't happened in a significant way. In other words, the Islamic State kind of dabbled around. They're a terrorist organization, but they dabbled around with drug dealing and a little bit of antiquity sales. The drug cartels in both Mexico and Colombia are the most dangerous ones. They are business organizations. They're not ideologically oriented the way the Islamic State is. But boy, think about what if the convergence of the Islamic State and drug cartels, if they come together, those two streams, it's like in Ghostbusters. You don't want the streams to cross. And so far they have not. You mentioned the DEA. There's a lot to criticize. There's a lot to admire about the DEA, but they are keenly aware of the danger of convergence. And that's what I talk about in that particular publication.
Just like to mention that you and I have mutual friends. I won't give their last names, but Mike and Heidi. And so they do send their regards and knew that we'd have a great conversation. So Mike and Heidi.
He's still my beating heart. They are two real heroes of the Republic. And I think we can say they're DEA people, since that's pretty obvious. But these are two remarkable DEA agents. I'm very proud to be friends with both of them. That's a nice connection to know.
Yeah, I'm very proud too. And but the friends of what is it? How's the old saying? Friend of my enemy is my enemy.
Yeah.
So why would it be far-fetched to think that maybe it wouldn't be Islamic terrorists? It would be China and coming in.
No,
and,
excellent point. Excellent point.
Because
excellent point. Yeah, I can almost say that's a third stream of danger. Could be China, could be Russia, could be North Korea, could be Venezuela, could be Cuba, could have been Syria. That chess piece is off the board, thank God. But yes, absolutely. So think terrorism, drug cartels, and rogue regimes would be the third leg. Excellent point.
Well, there is an effort by many advocates in the drug space to have fentanyl declared a weapon of mass destruction. Do you have thoughts on that? Good, bad, or undecided?
I think well, first of all, let's sketch the scale here. Every year, tens of thousands of Americans, you probably know the exact number, are killed through fentanyl poisoning effectively. So it's mass, it's destruction, it's coming across our borders. There's a lot of intel that would indicate there is rogue nation involvement in it. So I think it is certainly possible to portray that as a weapon of mass destruction being used against the United States. I think you would again know the precise number, but I think in 1 year more Americans die of fentanyl poisoning than have died at the hands of terrorists in 20 years since 9/11. So I think it is a conversation well worth having. It is coming from famously China. And here I think there's a dual rogue state action alongside business activity. It's quite profitable. And it's also coming up from Latin America. And in particular, the Mexican drug cartels had been on a fentanyl tear for the last couple of years. So yeah, there is a significant level of real danger to American citizens here in our own country. Now, I think we need to be careful about saying, and therefore, we're in a state of war with China, or therefore, we're going to invade Mexico. I think those would be overreaches in terms of the level of the threat. So what should we be doing? I think there are three things we should do. One is what we're discussing now, and it's go to any state that is participating or permitting the flow of fentanyl toward the United States and demarche them and tell them there will be consequences and start imposing real economic consequences and ultimately, if we need to, God forbid, military consequences. So go after the state actors involved. Number two, increase the budget for the interdiction forces that are involved in this. It's not just DEA, but CBP, the FBI, the whole intelligence community. Get this under the spotlight of the national intelligence world and the interdiction forces. And number three, we got work to do here in the United States. These are victims who are turning to illicit substances for a variety of reasons that range from mental health to poverty to unemployment. They're looking for relief of some kind. We owe them, I think, better care. So you got to go after the production side. You got to go after the transit zone. You got to go after the market here. You can't solve it by going at any one of those pieces.
Treasury has been engaged last year, and which was great to see. But just to go back on the WMD question, fentanyl has been weaponized before. I believe the Russians used it against the Chechens in a theater a long time ago. So it's not that far-fetched. But, I think what's scary is that they're targeting our military-aged youth. They're targeting our kids. And it's not only mental health or pain relief, but a lot of these kids are deliberately being targeted by the dealers. These are no longer your street-level dealers. These are people who are finding a kid via Snapchat, deliberately, reaching out to a kid using emojis and all the things that they do. And I don't want to just single out Snapchat because these bad guys are going to find a conduit to our kids.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So we try to talk a lot, that maybe you can't, as a parent, protect yourself from a WMD. At least that's not our intention on this podcast to scare people, but you can for making sure your kids stay away from illicit drugs and illicit pills.
I think that's powerfully correct. And I would add to it, any of these apps, and of course, TikTok is very much in the news right now, but they all have one thing in common. They come to our kids in one way, and it's right here. It's right here. And by the way, Mary, you know this, I'm sure, the average age when we hand a child this supercomputer is about 11 years old. And I think that we have work to do as parents, as grandparents in my case, as Congress folk. For example, Australia is now aggressively banning the use of certain applications, certain devices from children. I think that's I'm going to add that as kind of a fourth thing for what we ought to be doing about fentanyl. And it's not just fentanyl, but it's that information piece of this where we need to get better control. And, you think about that supercomputer, that iPhone in your pocket, it's wonderful. It can access all the world's knowledge. It can play every symphony ever recorded. It can show any film ever made. It can instantly connect point to point anywhere in the world. It's amazing. On the other hand, as we're talking about, it'll connect you to a river of pornography and filth and advocacy for using illicit drugs and dangerous behaviors. We have a lot of work to do on that side as well. So thanks for raising that.
Financial scams, I mean, you name it. My husband likes to talk about the computing capacity of an iPhone or Android, let's not be picky here, far exceeds the computing capacity that they had on the space shuttle. Yeah. And you think, as you said, this is in the hands of your 12-year-old, and oh my goodness, what does this mean? And I do hope that Congress continues to investigate and talk about privacy and threats. But if we can fast forward, we're recording this, we're talking right now just before the change of the administration. We're going to have a new president. And regardless of that, and who would forget about the outcome of the election, it seems to me, and I hate to use this expression, and I tell you the truth, I don't even know the origin of this expression, but is the world going to hell in a handbasket? If you can tell me where that came from.
I think all listeners should immediately Google hell in a handbasket. I would love to know where that expression comes from. I'm going to do it the minute we get off here. I don't know either. It is a great expression. And yes, it feels like the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Let me, however, give you 2 or 3 places where I think there can be some immediate improvement. And the new incoming team is actually in a pretty good place in terms of timing. One is in the Middle East, simply because Israel has now absolutely broken Hamas down in Gaza. They've seriously bent, if not broken, Hezbollah to the north. They have participated in the overthrow, if you will, of, or let's just say Assad has left Syria. Those are 3 big threats to Israel that have now been taken off the chessboard. Iran deeply weakened by all these events. So you've got a kind of an opportunity in the Middle East, I think, for a ceasefire, potentially for a peacekeeping force, and then thirdly for Israel to be recognized by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, bringing the Arab world and the Israeli world truly close together in a way that kind of blocks Iran on the chessboard. So look for quieter and maybe some progress in the Middle East. I know it's hard to believe it, but compared to the last year, I think it's going to maybe get a bit better. And everything I just said, I'd say I have a 70% confidence in. 30% wheels come off, bigger war with Iran, a lot of variables, but let's call it 70%. We're going to see some incremental upside. I think the administration's well positioned to take advantage. Second is Ukraine. Here, both sides, both Ukraine and Russia, are burning through troops, burning through capital, burning through international support. I think it, again, 70% confidence. Trump administration will be able to get them to some kind of a negotiation. What does that deal look like? Too soon to tell. But I think in the course of this year, you could see a ceasefire there, a negotiation, because both sides are significantly beaten down at this point. And then, Mary, third and finally, I think in China, Team Trump has a chance because the Chinese economy is very weak right now, and they're not in a position to take very aggressive stances, particularly if the Trump team follows through on some of the ideas they've floated about major tariffs. That's I think it's a negotiating tactic, but it's a good one. And I think it could induce China to level the playing field on trade, reduce the trade payment imbalance. Again, 70% chance, 30% chance it could really get dicey in the Pacific as well. But, I'll put it another way. Compared to where we were a year ago, when the Middle East was literally on fire, when you could see no possibility of a negotiation in Ukraine, China was really pushing hard and aggressively in the South China Sea. I think the Trump team has an opportunity here to kind of calm the water somewhat and make some progress in those three areas.
Does Clinton claiming the desire to reclaim the Panama Canal calm fears or stoke them?
I think that is not a good idea. And I'll tell you something, I've been through the Panama Canal too many times to count, and I've done it both as an American naval officer when it was run by the United States, and I've done it while it's being run by the Panamanians. You cannot tell the difference. Panama has run the canal extremely professionally, and, the kind of loose talk of taking the canal back. Another one that's not landing well is Canada as the 51st state. That's not going over well in Canada. A lot of this is firing for effect, and a lot of it is theater. And I look at the appointments of Team Trump. I think Marco Rubio is a good choice for state. I think
Indeed.
Mike Waltz is a terrific choice for national security advisor. He's not well known. He's very steady hand, Army colonel, and just really a good choice. Susie Wiles, I know quite well, the chief of staff, good choice. Secretary Treasury designate Basant, I think, is a very strong choice. There are some good folks coming in the zones that I focus on. So let's watch that space and see what happens.
Some interesting choices for sure. Chris Wright for DOE. I've known Chris for a long time, and he certainly wouldn't have been an obvious choice, but I think he's a great choice. Doug Burgum.
Yeah, or Doug Burgum, the governor from Dakota, I think looks to me to be a very solid choice. Look, every president's going to pick people to surround himself with. Some of the other choices I have less confidence in, but that's why there's a confirmation process, as you know well. And let's see what shakes out, and let's see who steps into office at the end of January. And let's hope, at least in the sphere we're talking about, the international world, we can start to do some good.
Absolutely. One quick question for you. Iraq, I'm going way back here, but what my thinking process here is, whenever we draw a line in the sand, we better be damn well willing to enforce that. And I felt that we learned, and I took that vote, right, that when they're kicking out the weapons inspectors, right. And we had moving the goalpost seems to me to be one of the most dangerous things to do. And I think, Netanyahu, for, all of the criticism he's received and the threats and, being declared a war criminal, I mean, it seems to me his strength as the tip of the spear for us has been remarkable. And I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it easily, because I know a lot of people have died and are suffering. I think about that often. But with China, and I know you're thinking their economy is weak, so therefore they will not be building up materialistically, building up the military. Sure. Get your words out, Mary. However, it seems to be their ethos that they're so focused on it. They're so focused on naval dominance. They're so focused on, and will there be a line in the sand then? And should we really be careful never to draw an ironclad line in the sand?
We should not declare a red line and then not enforce it. And I think the most salient example of that, and I fault the Obama administration for this, is on chemical weapons in Syria. We walked away after having said to Assad, if you use chemical weapons against your people, you are gone. That's a big deal thing to set out a red line like that and then not do anything about it. So that question, relatively easy to answer. There are times when you should have a red line, but there's not an obvious one to me at the moment, either in China or in the Middle East or in Ukraine. I think all three of those situations are still at the point where negotiation helps, where having a plan helps. In terms of China, we do need to increase our naval forces because China is dramatically increasing their capabilities in that regard. We need to, as you and I were just talking about, have an information and tech strategy that allows us not to be taken advantage of, not to have our population manipulated. All of those are very real concerns. They're still at the stage where we can negotiate without simply saying, hey, you do it our way or we're going to blow up your country. That's, generally speaking, not a very good outcome for us, or certainly for the nation that we end up targeting. Hey, as we wrap up, because we've talked a lot about a lot of challenges and things that are going wrong, let me tell you a couple of things that I think are actually going pretty well. And the first one is that the United States still enjoys very strong alliances around the world. We have this NATO alliance, very capable. We have very strong alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, Thailand. I could go on and on. We have this network of alliances around the world that's really unheard of in human history in terms of the scope and the scale of it. That's a powerful force for good for the United States. I think number two, something that's going well is energy and energy production. We've got to, I think, obviously pursue renewables, but we are the world's dominant energy producer at this point. It's a real capability for us. Number three, technology. You know, love him or hate him, Elon Musk is a genius. And the point is, he is only an example of these belts of innovation that are built in Silicon Valley and Austin, Texas, and Route 128 in Boston and Miami. Number four, we are this continental powerhouse of a country. Our demographics are good. People want to come here. And yeah, I get it. We got to control our border. That's table stakes. But one of our great advantages is that people want to come here. As a four-star admiral, I visited 100 countries. Every American embassy, there's a line of people around the block who want to come here. And by the way, those are the smart, innovative, dynamic people. So we've got a lot going for us here in the United States. Our biggest challenge, I know you'd agree with me, are our internal divisions and the degree to which we can get over the election. And listen, if your candidate won, don't gloat about it. And if your candidate lost, don't whine about it. No one wants to hear either of those. What we ought to be doing is saying, look at that basket of alliances and capabilities and all that I just sketched out. Take pride in it, and let's figure out a way to, have disagreements about policy and arguments. Let's get away from the bitter acrimony, the finger pointing, all that nonsense. If we do that, I think the future is very bright for our country, and I am cautiously optimistic we will do that.
Well, I love that, and especially because a lot of this discord is being pushed by adversaries and
on both sides,
right?
On both sides, and that's not helping anything.
But I love that you've taken us to a positive place to end on a positive note. I think it is important to recognize and not be so myopic on the election and how we're feeling today or what the headlines say today that piss us off on our own feed, right?
Oh, totally.
So thank you so much for giving us a sense of optimism. And you're right. And I think more and more countries do want to align with us as they see as the world turns. So I want to thank you so much for
my pleasure
being here. What a thrill and a joy. And again, I will, Mike and Heidi will listen to this, and so they'll be thrilled that you showed such affection for them. And
I've got to just do one thing on Mike and Heidi, and you'll get this because you know them. These are two, very attractive, very tall, very stylish people. And at my daughter's wedding, they came and they dominated the dance floor. They were
no. Well, I could see Heidi doing that, but Mike, really?
Nope, he's quite good out there.
That's
right.
awesome. Well, thank you so much, Admiral.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing you and watching you and finishing Restless Wave. Again, pick it up. I have it on my Kindle. Buy it wherever you buy your books and download them. And we look forward to connecting and staying on top of a lot of things together. So thank you for joining us on Sagely Speaking. And thank you to my listeners for joining us. I hope you found today's episode as fascinating as I did, and also positive, a lot of positive energy about a perspective on the future from a man who knows it, both from a business perspective and the military perspective. So to my sponsors, thank you. Couldn't do this without you. And until we meet again here on Sagely Speaking, be well.